Welcome once again to The Lost Signals discusses games and gaming culture, a pretentious, philosophical, pedantic podcast where we focus on various aspects of video games as well as other issues and topics within gaming in general. Hello there, and welcome back to The Lost Signals Games and Gaming Culture. And I am in search of my next item to upgrade to get to the next part of the map. Scott Thurlow, here with my friends Jonathan Ian Manzer.
Goddamn Medusa heads.
Yep, and Stephen Amosi.
Always running for that next fucking treasure.
Exactly. And as you may have gathered, tonight we're sort of continuing our sort of broad genre coverage, and it will be Metroidvania as the genre we're focusing on. So, sort of like how we did roguelikes a while back, let's start off with sort of defining the traits and features of what a Metroidvania is. And I would say, like, it's weird because it's like when you say Metroidvania, like if you're familiar, like you know exactly what kind of game you're getting into. But because, and maybe when we after we define it right now, then we'll go to the lineage of it. But I have like here, it's sort of convoluted. It's not an easy description, but for the most part, they are like 2D or 2D.5-ish platformers, adventure games in which you have access to like the whole world, the whole map. It's not like cut up into linear levels, but oftentimes, if not always, you need an item or, like I said, an upgrade or something to go to an area that you see like, oh, I can go here, but I can't access it yet because I need, again, some item or something within the game that then I can, and then it opens up the next part of the map and so forth. Then you sort of backtrack a bit and then maybe can go to another part that was also open and so forth. So it's like mostly that. So what do you guys make of that?
It's the illusion of a open world with actually being a fairly standard linear progression. Because
I like the illusion part, yeah.
You have, in Metroid, it's very famous for you need a rocket in order to open the door.
Right.
And you can see the door, you just don't have the key yet to do it.
Exactly.
With the skill. But
Yeah, and they do this pretty well with some newer games that we'll definitely talk about as we go throughout this. But I really want to kind of say that this is I think that as we talk about it, our definition is going to change a little bit.
It might.
In terms of the way that we are presenting what Metroidvania games are, because I think that the genre has really gotten a lot more open to interpretation.
I would certainly agree with that.
In the last few years. But what I initially had here, and what the initial, I think, kind of definition, as you gave one earlier, Scott, one that I found in an article that I was looking at was side-scrolling action-adventure games with obstacles in a continuous map that you can surmount only after finding the requisite items and backtracking. Yeah,
that's probably more well stated than I said, but it's the general idea remains, right?
And I think that was a definition given by I forget what his first name is,
Thomas Happ.
Yeah,
yes.
Thomas Happ, the designer of Axiom Verge. So, and I think that in terms of this whole thing, a lot of this stuff, perhaps in games that are Metroidvania, or like maybe even Metroidvania Light or something, whatever other definition we give them. Although I don't know if Light's the correct term, but like
Metroidvania-ish, we'll say.
Like I think that the most important thing to this, actually, after thinking about it a little bit, is the backtracking section of it, and saying like, look, you've been to these parts of the world, but you have to go back and find something that you either couldn't access before or missed before or something like that.
Yeah.
And like that, this happens so often in these types of games that I think it's actually the thing that makes Metroidvania a Metroidvania.
It might be the defining feature. Yeah.
Well, it's also, so I'm going to take Mario for a second, which is not one, Castlevania or Metroid, which is the name defining, and the RPG elements, is that you have skill progression, you have character growth in a Metroidvania, but you don't have the choice as you do in a role-playing game. It's
true,
It's a standard progression.
You need X item to access Y area. You're right about that's true.
Versus like just a 2D like Mario is, you don't really need any items that you get to beat a specific level. It's all about just making it through to the next, to move on. So, again, I think that yes, the backtracking element is important, but I also think it's that specific skill leveling system to this.
Or like, well, we'll call like ability/item upgrades. We'll lump them together. No, I mean, I would certainly agree with that. And so you just mentioned it. So I'll we'll do not a brief history even, but I mean, the name itself comes from the original Metroid, and also like for the NES, and then Super Metroid, I think was the one that everybody like pointed to. And then the thing that was strange to me is like the Vania part of it, that is to say Castlevania, didn't really enter like the first 3 or 4 even Castlevania games were definitely like straight up linear. Like, well, I guess 2 a little bit, but for the most part, it was cut up into discrete stages, and you don't really backtrack anywhere. But Symphony of the Night is the one that everybody points to, where you're in Dracula's castle, and yeah, you can go here and there. And as you get more abilities and so forth, like you get the ability to turn into mist, which then allows you, of course, to access areas that you couldn't before that, and so forth. So like that's the one like that both of them sort of codified it and then slapped together, and then any other game henceforth that contained these elements was labeled Metroidvania. Which, yeah, I mean, like I said, it makes sense, like the way you laid it out. And then, as you mentioned, Steve-O, I would say in the recent, like, let's say the past 5 to 7-ish years, we have seen a rise in like smaller, like indie Metroidvania games.
A spate of,
right. There's been a whole bunch of them, and I can name off a few. But you mentioned one. Axiom Verge is, I think, one of the best. Like, at least I think it might be my personal favorite recently. But that brings me to another question I want to ask you guys: is that what's the appeal? Like, is it easier to design them, or like, you know, why is it become such a long-lived genre, and in fact resurging to this day? Do you think?
Well, do you mean from a developer standpoint or from an audience standpoint?
Yeah, both. You take which one you want to talk about, and or both, or pick one first and go for it.
Well, I'm a fan of puzzle games, as you know, and this is inherently what it is, because the backtracking element of it and the skill level is it adds an element of like, puzzle solving to it.
For
like,
sure.
Where do I need there's points I remember in Super Metroid, it's like, where do I go next? I have to go now find.
Got to remember.
I have a skill, a new skill. Where can I apply it? And also, I don't think there's generally kind of segments you don't need to go to beat the game, but like not necessarily treasure rooms in that sense, but like secret, like hidden areas rooms that you can find too. So there is that element of puzzle that's different than just a straight linear shot through.
Yeah, I mean,
for sure.
I think it's actually. I'm glad that you asked that question, Ian. Good question, Scott, and Ian. Good follow-up question about like the developers and the, whether you're talking about the developers or the players, because I think that the reason that these are popular is because this is the type of game that's for both, right? Like the idea of a Metroidvania game, if we'll talk about developers first, is that it's kind of easier to make than an open world RPG.
Yeah, it certainly is.
It doesn't require you, writing 7 lines of dialogue for each character. It's actually fairly linear. It's just that you have to go back and retread your steps a little bit to go back to find things that you couldn't get to earlier, and like.
Or like I said, remember, like, oh, I saw a door, but I know I couldn't access it early on.
So, like, good RPGs combine elements of both of these. Like, even the old, like, Zelda games, you had to, like, there were things that you couldn't get to that you had to go back and do, right? But, like, this makes it a step easier if you're developing this type of game where you don't have to develop a ton of dialogue or whatever around like all this stuff. You don't have to have like this person send you off in 7 different directions or anything like that.
Yeah, true. That's a funny point.
In terms of players, I think they like it because it kind of feels open world, even though it's actually not. And like if you think about it, you realize that pretty quickly, but it doesn't take away from the fact that it feels like you have a lot more options than you actually do available. And that's especially when these games were first starting to come out. If we're talking about the old school, like retro Castlevania, like Symphony of the Night, and the first 2 Metroid games, it was difficult for games at the time to spare the memory to make an actually open world game. So they had to kind of find ways around that. And and find ways to make players feel that, even though it wasn't actually the case. And like I think these types of games are specifically perfectly designed to do that type of thing. And it's the same way for like indie developers now. They don't have a team of writers there. They have maybe 2 or 3
they
people
might,
or
but
whatever.
yeah, a very small team. Yeah,
and it's a lot.
it's more economical.
Yeah,
I'll say
it's more economical, and you can still kind of give that story that you want to give that feels open worldish without having to develop, all these NPCs
a full blown open world. Yeah.
that like just are there. Maybe some of them matter and some of them don't. Whatever, like that type of thing.
Because I haven't played many of the new ones, but would another trait of it be respawning enemies?
I think that certainly seems to be like, I don't know if it's a necessary trait, but I guess I'll say traditionally that is the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like once you go off a certain area of the screen and you return, then all the enemies respawn, and like that way you can sort of use your new tools on them sometimes, or sometimes it's even necessary to. But I think if we're doing like a roguelike sort of, when we went down to like this is the core elements of a Metroidvania game, I think that's probably at this point sort of an unwritten rule that like that happens. Because I have another list of a couple other games.
I was going to actually just ask if you have like a list of like standard Metroidvania games.
Yeah, so like not standards per se, but like ones that were like very it's very always, I don't know how to say this. Many people were like point to like, okay, this is one. Like I said, I mentioned Axiom. There's a game called Sundered, which I actually picked up a little bit while ago, and like again, once you make it through a certain area and you go back, then all the enemies are there again. Mm-hmm. And like sometimes, like one of you said something about like, the illusion of it being. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good point, because like it feels like, oh shit, I can go everywhere, or whatever. Like it's a big world, but not
until you hit the barrier.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Until you hit whatever is going to prevent your progress there, and then you find whatever that may open it up. And like some of it is like you said, like puzzle solving. Like, okay, now I have this and this, that item, ability, upgrade, etc., what have you. Now let me go back and basically experiment, like apply them all to whatever barriers were in place beforehand, and which ones I can get to and which ones like still seem blocked.
Exactly. Like imagine if in Mario you could, like, you beat a bunch of levels and then you get an item and you can go back to a level that you beat
and fuck around with it.
And like it'll allow you to get to a secret part of the level or something like that. Like, it's not exactly that, but it's that type of thing.
It's similar, right? It's sort of like the design element sort of like live in the space between, like it's above the linear levels, right? But it's not quite open world as RPG. However, I did want to mention that Symphony of the Night, like again, one of the codifiers, does have an like XP system, and like there's equipable items like fucking gear and shit. But again, some of that even like is necessary to progress.
Right.
All right. So just to challenge that for a minute, though, Crash Bandicoot. There are you get like gems, and if you get certain gems, it unlocks things in past levels, and you can progress farther than you could in maybe like secret areas. And I would never say that those are necessarily I would never say they're Metroidvania, not even necessarily.
No, I get you.
But so it is weird that other games do it. And when you mentioned Mario, I think like, I don't know if it was Mario 64, but later Mario games did have like new tools you can go and do things.
Even you're right. Even Super Mario World for SNES, like you could go back and fuck around and stuff. That's true. You could always revisit the levels, but, and there are ways to like.
I will never say that they are.
Right. So like I would say like, sorry, real quick, I'll address it, and then you. Is that like, the Crash Bandicoot thing is a good one. Like those are like, it's almost like Sonic 2. Like they're like little secret things, but not necessary, right? Mm-hmm. I would say in a Metroidvania game, you need to explore most of the map and have your upgrades. Like that's like a bonus thing. Like, oh, if I want to, I can go back and get whatever gems and like see whatever the hidden stuff is, but you don't need to do that. So I think that might be like more of a way to cut it up to answer that.
It almost feels like they're not. It almost feels like these games aren't as cut and dried as Metroidvania fans or whatever want you to think.
Maybe it's a little bit more ill-defined than than it seems on the surface.
Like Metroidvania, I feel like, is more of a like the feeling you get from a game as opposed to the exact mechanics.
Yeah, I like that statement.
In a lot of ways that these like these like subgenres are that what was the other one that we did? We did
roguelikes.
On roguelikes, which we found a lot of like outs for those games as well. That
Yeah,
I
that's
think
true.
this thing is kind of roguelike in this way, and
Yeah, true.
The thing is, I don't think there's any specific cut and dried
Yes.
rules
But
for
you
these
know
games.
what it is and it isn't. So
Right.
just one lesson, and I'll stop making this point though.
No,
Because I just didn't remember that the Mario 64 game, to complete it 100%, you need to unlock the hats.
right.
And then you can go
Then you
back
can
to
get all the
certain
coins
things
and whatever,
and
yeah.
go and get
Yeah.
other stars that you couldn't get on your first run. But again, so it's just the backtracking.
So how
isn't
come that
necessarily-
game isn't Metroidvania?
Maybe it's because the 2D element is necessary for it. So I don't
But
wanna
in terms of
jump ahead here. Is that I was brought up earlier before we did this cast that Psycho 2
Sekiro.
Shadows Don't Die Twice or whatever.
Sounds like a fucking James Bond film, by the way. But yeah.
But to me, in a way, I thought because I haven't played that far into it, but in the initial part, there's 2 stages you can enter. Well, not
2 areas.
early on. You get this, and in the first area, you can progress far enough until you're kind of blocked by an ogre. Now you can beat it theoretically through sheer willpower and dying 1,000 times, or it points you to go into the next area to get a skill item so that it helps you beat the
Right.
ogre.
Right.
And I'm like, this is actually very, to me, Metroidvania-ish, because you need to get that skill item to move back. But again, maybe the 2D is required for it to be fully described as such.
So that's a really interesting thing. You're talking about 2 different things that are interesting to me in terms of this, right? Is 2D side scroller necessary
100% necessary.
part of Metroidvania, or can 3D games be a Metroidvania game as well? I think that you're right in terms of Sekiro. I mean, I haven't played it yet, but I've watched a bunch of it, and also I played all the Dark Souls games, and they felt the same
I was
way.
gonna
Where
bring
it's
those
like,
up.
and this is a really interesting topic that we're going to talk about. I don't know if you guys want to talk about it now or a little bit later, but I definitely want to get into soft locks versus hard locks, which is something that So I read an article about this. Damn it, we'll put it up on the site.
I believe it was a
I can't
Gamma Sutra
remember
article.
the specifics right now, but one of the people interviewed is talking about being interested in games that have soft locks over hard locks, which the difference is basically hard locks means that you need an item or something to progress in the game. Even though it looks like you can get through that door, you need the rocket, as you mentioned earlier. That's a hard lock. You can't get through there until you have the rocket. Soft lock is like, this is way more difficult if you don't have this specific item, which is
But
what
it's technically accessible.
Soulsborne,
Yeah.
Sekiro games have in spades in terms of those types of games. Is like, you're supposed to go this one way, but if you just try to brute force it and are really good at the game, you can go this other way. But like, you really what the game quote unquote wants you to
It like
do
nudges you into
is
that. Yeah.
to level up and
Okay, good.
get other items that
Of
will help
course.
you on your way. Which I'm really interested in if this genre going forward in it having those soft lock type of situations, because I think that makes for more interesting gameplay to me.
I think it's certainly more versatile. Like when you do that, of course, like a hard lock, like you said, like you can't like fuck you. You have to get whatever
Yeah.
to access the next area.
But would it then be
Right.
Metroidvania?
And then how does it change?
But yeah,
of course,
but does
I
that
knew you
make it
were
a
gonna say that.
Metroidvania game? And that's the other thing to me. Does it matter? Do things have to be like
yes.
specifically Metroidvania or not Metroidvania? Or is it like Metroidvania-like?
That's the only question in life.
Yeah, well,
Rogue-
that's what I'm trying to figure out. The only question in life is whether things are Metroidvania or not. Clearly,
Life is
it revolves around that.
Is life Metroidvania? That's the question.
I think it is.
There are plenty of hard locks.
not 2D though.
Well,
Oh.
we're not sure about that. We'll see. But no, like I want to go back for just a little bit. That one of you mentioned, like things like Zelda, Link to the Past, the one that comes to mind.
Mm.
But like there was a game recently, a couple years ago. One of I liked it. It was an indie game called Hyper Light Drifter, which was more Zelda like an homage, but it certainly I think had Metroidvania-ish elements in the case of like you need a certain gun or again a certain skill or whatever to advance, but you could. It straddled that line between like sort of the Soulsborne thing where you could go to area whatever if you didn't have it, but good fucking luck getting through that.
Yeah,
but it's
exactly.
technically possible, right? So like, yeah, I do think there's like, it's more of like maybe a more blurry line, but it's just weird. Like one of you said too, like it's almost like the feel of it. You're like, oh, this feels Metroidvania. Like whether or not even like any given game sells itself on being that genre.
And can you be? So here's another question: Can you have that Metroidvania feel without truly being a Metroidvania game?
Yeah, I think it's possible. Yeah, or at least again aspects of it for sure.
Axiom Verge certainly is.
Yeah, Axiom Verge is one of the like closest I think like sticks to the. What would everyone defines as Metroidvania?
Hold on, what is a Metroidvania?
Yeah, even though it's not part of either Metroid nor.
Well, that's it doesn't need to be in those series, but like Axiom Verge is basically the definition of a Metroidvania game.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's the modern one.
It's literally everything about that I read out of that definition is that game.
And if I recall, I believe like one of the levels or like parts of the maps in Axiom is like very, very closely like a mirror of
direct
the original
reference to Metroid. Yeah. I mean, the whole game feels like a Metroid game.
There are Castlevania games that have less to do with Metroidvania than
yeah, right. It's strange. You're right. That's what I wanted to bring up earlier. Like, it's weird that like that became like the moniker that people attach to it because like, again. Symphony of the Night was like the fourth or fifth Castlevania.
I think it just sounds good.
Yeah. It just rolls off the tongue.
Yeah.
I guess, but like, it's just strange. But like, again, it's almost like the pornography thing. I know it when I see it. Right?
But I mean, that was another thing that was discussed in that article is the reason that it's Metroidvania is because those Metroid games were great, but this didn't become like a genre until after Symphony of the Night.
Yeah.
And like,
exactly.
that's exactly why it's Metroidvania is because Symphony of the Night, like, took what Metroid was doing and they were like, oh, this can work in other games. And that's when you started having other games like that. And I think that, like, the other thing is, like, it died down for a long time until, like, 2000, I want to say 3 or 4, when Cave Story, I think, was like...
that's the one I was getting to.
Yeah, was the one that came out and
sort of
really...
Like, put it back on the map.
Yeah, really started getting Metroidvania going again.
Mm-hmm.
And I never played Cave Story, but I heard it was, like, good and fun and just a straight up, like, Metroidvania type game. But it kind of, I feel like that genre was basically dead until that point. And
or like
people were like, oh shit, this is good. Yeah.
For sure. So one of you asked like about the 2D thing. So a quick thing on my notes is that the Prey, 2017's Prey, which I quite enjoyed, but it basically was a FPS immersive sim. However, you were able to unlock certain, again, abilities, items, etc., that you could backtrack through the space station, which is the setting of it. I'm like, oh, I can't access this airlock or whatever right now, but now that I have some other thing, like, so I had like, again, like a dash of Metroidvania, if that makes sense, right? Like it sort of felt it, even though it was like basically so far removed from what you think of as Metroidvania.
Yeah.
So then I'll bring up a thing: Doom and key cards.
Yeah. Right,
if you start going down the third person, not the first person shooter angle, there are a lot of games that require you to
have a
backtrack. I even think BioShock a little bit, like rarely, but occasionally had that go get an item from beat this boss and then backtrack the thing and go through. So I do think that for it to be Metroidvania, it has to be 2D. I'm going to stick by that.
All right. I'm not necessarily disagreeing.
I'm going to die on that hill.
It's the hill you're choosing to die on. But no, I don't necessarily disagree. It's just that, again, it seems as if like the definition of it is a lot less defined, if that as a tautology almost, a lot less clear cut than many pundits and so forth, like gamers and fans like think of it as it might be, as we're talking out right now.
You know what we should do? We should make a Metroidvania scale.
I thought you were going to say make a Metroidvania game.
From Metroid to Castlevania?
It's just Metroid 2 right in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I think that would be, so we could do like X and Y axes on this, even like 2D, 3D, you know, like man,
I'm gonna get you. But
I think
like,
it'd be interesting to like plot out games in terms of like where they fall on the
have like
Metroidvania
a giant chart of them or whatever.
Yeah.
But like the BioShock thing got me because you're right. Like, oh, I need Electro Bolt to unlock certain doors or whatever, and I can't advance without it.
The Sander Cohen portrait thing where you have to go to each hallway.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, it starts getting really like fuzzy on how.
You're right.
Again, I never once when playing that went. This
feels Metroidvania, right? Exactly. Yeah. So I guess maybe the definition is like, sure, it's going to be a bit subjective, but I think if you took a survey, like you said, like almost like plotted like the chart of it, like if you give someone a random game you're like, does it feel Metroidvania? And like, like again, you'll know it when you see it, sort of, even though it might not have to hit every single point or like have to have these definitely A, B, and C, 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if it doesn't, then it's not.
Well,
Right.
that's the interesting thing. Like, is there a definition that we could come up with that says to be a Metroidvania game, you have
must
to hit
be
each
whatever.
one of these
Yeah.
points? Or is it more of like
More loosely defined.
a loose, like, this feels like a Metroidvania game, and that's what the definition actually is, you know?
May I posit mine, which is the hard Metroidvania
Sure.
definition? A 2D side scroller with hard locks that require skills, backtracking through an illusory open world.
Yeah, I kind of like that too. Like, you both gave better definitions than I like, and I would pretty much subscribe to that. I think that would be more in line with what I would say if I saw a game that had those things. I'd be like, okay, it's certainly Metroidvania. Now, as games start to diverge more and more from that, like that sort of sentence you just laid out, then yeah, like then they can be like the FPS things or whatever, and not be like as easily classified as Metroidvania.
And so what's like, I guess, and the other question is, what's a game that is a 2D side scroller that has an illusory open world with soft blocks? That's not Metroidvania, you know? Like, not to try and, but like,
Oh, try.
what does that become? Like, what do you call that? Is that
Just a
Just an action platformer.
Castleoid.
it's Castleoid?
Castleoid. It's like the Dark
Yeah,
Mirror. It's like the
I don't know. I
the
think
mirror
it's-
version of it.
Yeah, I think it's an
It's
interesting.
the Dracula's Castle.
The inverted castle. Yeah.
I think it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of like when we're trying to define what these games are. What is the importance? A, what is the importance of defining them? And B, where do you draw the line? Is it like the feeling that you get from playing it, or is it more the feeling that you get from playing it, or is it more like the hard definitions?
Well, I have two answers to your first question. One, not at all. Two, we're nerdy academics who are interested in discussing, defining for the generations what
Yes.
things are.
Sure.
What was your second question?
What's the most important part of it? Is like the feeling, or is it the hard definition of like what we're talking
I
about?
think that
I think it's a moving target, to be honest, to a degree.
so. I don't believe in prescriptive definitions, as saying that. Even though I just gave one, it is a descriptive of how people like. And it really comes to your point. It's when I see it. What do I define it? When I play a game, do I go, "Oh, this is like this is a Metroidvania game," and then when I see it, how do I describe it? And I can't think of. I know there's a ton out there. I can think of like, Super Metroid, Symphony of the Night, Axiom, Verge. What are the common characteristics between all of these? And these are what when I play them, I view these are Castlevania
Well,
games.
it's like your set theory thing that you describe to, which I think again is valid to a large degree for sure. So to answer, like, not per se what you just asked, Evo, but I would say there's a lot of room to maneuver within it, right?
Mhm.
Like you said, like should it have only hard locks, soft locks, or like some mixture of both? I think you can have games that take little bits and pieces from all of them and still could be like roughly and generally defined as a Metroidvania game. But I think, yeah, it's a little, the line moves a bit more in this instance than perhaps versus some other genres that we've covered that are like more dead set, like more hardly defined.
Have you played any of the other games on your list?
Yes, so I played, they gave out one when I first got my PS4. It was early on, and one of the free ones they came out was called Dust: An Elysian Tale, which was it was 2D, and it was you go through and you get skills and so items and whatever, and go back and forth and unlock and progress through places that you were inaccessible previously. So when I played that game, I was like, "Yep, this is certainly a Metroidvania, at least ish game for sure," because it matched the points, at least in my mind, as I defined it, and when I see them, like I'm like, "Yep." it falls more within that than it would any other genre. So yeah, I mean, I haven't played that many, but like I said, like Axiom Verge probably is largely agreed. From like look it up, like the list of best modern Metroidvania games, it often makes the top, if not the top spot. Mm-hmm. But I thought Sundered was pretty good too. But it was like it actually had an RPG progression. Like you would go back to sort of a main hub in the map, and then once you built up enough XP from killing all the respawning enemies, you can unlock more skills. But you also had to find and fight bosses and acquire again items and so forth, upgrades from them to progress further in the various parts of the map.
Right.
So yeah, man, like I don't know, like and to me, like it's not even nostalgia because here's one of my video game sins, if you will. I never owned the original Metroids, the first one, or even Super Metroid, so I didn't play them that much. Like I just never. It wasn't part of my library.
I don't think you can talk about this topic.
Of course I can. Keep your opinions as I want. I just like for me, like it's a blinder spot. Everyone's like, oh man, like it's not a nostalgia spot for me. And you, Ian, do not like nostalgia all that much. So like I'm just saying in this instance, but I still enjoy the style of game, even though it's not like as hardwired to my original like kid gaming mind.
So Super Metroid is one of the best games of all time. So
yes, it's largely agreed. Like, I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying I didn't own it, so I didn't play it as much.
I'm just saying.
All right.
I just say it's all.
But I did actually. So what I did do is, speaking of things on PS4 as well, I might be elsewhere, might be on Xbox or whatever. But there was a bundle for Symphony of the Night and one of the other ones, Rondo of Blood. But that one is more linear. But I was like, $10. Yeah, let me try to play through Symphony again. And like, I made it far enough, but it's still pretty like unforgiving. Like it's grueling compared to like some other shit. But, and you had mentioned like, the Dark Souls thing. And like, the thing is, we were, again, somewhat discussing it, or like, it could be said to perhaps have some elements of it because of the way it's designed, but it's not necessarily, again, like, when I say, hey, is Dark Souls a Metroidvania? I'm like, no, it's a fucking Souls game, of course, is what people are going to say to me, right? But like, just the intrinsic design elements, I think you can point to at least, if not a straight line, like parts of them.
They certainly looked at, when they were designing that game, they certainly looked at the way that Metroidvania games worked and did some, speaking of which, right up
you
there,
can't see
like
it behind us.
The fucking level design on the original Dark Souls is very Metroidvania-esque in terms of like being able to progress back through and actually done better than a lot of Metroidvania games where it's a pain in the ass to get back levels. Mm-hmm. Like in this, you open up like gates that allow you to travel quickly and things like that.
Would you say that if Dark Souls was made as a 2D side-scroller, it would be a Metroidvania game?
I would be heavily inclined to say yes.
That's a really good question. Didn't they do a game like that?
Yes, like it was called Salt and Sanctuary, I believe.
Did you play that one?
I did not.
Okay. Yeah, I remember it coming out. I never played it either, but I wanted to... I thought that was an interesting...
like take on it
thing to try and do, because I feel like those types of games, I mean, maybe they could do a good job, but like I feel like it wouldn't really work as like a 2D side scroller because there's so much
because then it limits your movement, of course.
There's so much extra. The reason that they're so hard is because you have to be kind of in control of your entire environment, and when you limit it to just 2D and a couple of movements, it makes it hard. I would think it makes it harder as a developer to make it that complex and difficult to try and. But
I played some 2D side scrollers which were just bullet hell, so that's difficult and complex.
Yeah, but I mean,
that's bullet hell will be covered.
I wouldn't say it's quite the same thing. But to answer your question, yes. I mean, if it were possible to make Dark Souls a 2D side scroller, I would
then it would be
call it a Metroidvania game type game.
He's counting that as a win.
So I'll give you that win. No, I mean I am almost of the opinion that Dark Souls and all the sequels and Bloodborne and Sekiro are Metroidvania type games. I don't want to call them Metroidvania because they don't have the 2D dynamic, aesthetic, but a lot of the other things that make something a Metroidvania game are there.
So Souls games are just the 3D versions Metroidvania.
They're the natural progression of
The logical conclusion.
AAA type Metroidvania games. Like
I like it.
now that like the reason that Symphony of the Night and Metroid were 2D side scrollers is because that's what they could
Limitations of
do with
technology
the
at the
technology
time,
at the
sure.
time. And
They haven't done much since, or at least Metroid with 3D. So
Yeah, the latter Metro games are supposed to kind of suck. Or
I heard that.
couple
Yeah, I
ones
heard
before
the
that.
Wii one wasn't
Yeah.
that great. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't be. I feel like they need to get a good developer on that. Whatever. That's a whole other thing.
you need to get from software.
Perhaps
That'd be
an
fucking
incredible
interesting.
matchup. Yeah, but no. So it seems like we've come to a spot where we can sort of agree, like broadly,
Yeah.
upon what defines it and the feel of it. But I will say, so it's supposed to be coming out. It's got kickstarted a while back. The director the original game director of the Castlevania series is putting out a game called Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, which in theory is like a real Metroidvania because it's actually Castlevania,
Right.
but should be in that style. Unfortunately, as far as I know, I haven't had a release date yet, but it's still looking to be on track. But it did get pushed back here and there. But I certainly myself I'm definitely going to be checking it out. So perhaps when it does come out, I'll be like, it's definitely a Metroidvania because, like I said,
Yeah.
it falls in within. It's the spiritual successor to the original namer / codifier of this genre. So yeah,
Absolutely.
I think now that we've agreed to be able to somewhat broadly come in line with what we think is Metroidvania, like I'm always interested in them because I think, as one of you mentioned earlier, like the puzzle solving aspect, like it has a lot of like elements that come together. So like the combat and so forth, and then like getting a cool gun or a cool weapon or whatever, and then solving a puzzle or like figuring out to use whatever item or upgrade it may be to get to the next part and see the next part and so forth and progress and finish the story of the game. So yeah, man, I'm not like, again, this is just another one in the genres I wanted to cover, and it was an interesting conversation. And if you're out there, you can drop us a comment if you would like. What do you think defines Metroidvania? And if there are any games out there that you played that we haven't mentioned that fall into it, certainly let me know at least, if not these jokers, because I'll make an effort to check it out. But yeah, other than that, any other final thoughts or arguments we can get into how to define things?
I don't think so.
Right.
I think I've said all that I need to say.
Yeah.
Maybe more.
Perhaps even beyond
Definitely
that. He had 102% map completion, like found the secret room. But yeah, other than that, I think that'll do it for this episode. I've been Scott Thurlow trying to shoot rockets at the door to unlock it, and I've been here with Jonathan Ian Manzer.
I'm playing Destroy All Humans, which is definitely not a Castlevania or Metroidvania game.
Yeah. And Steven Amosi.
I'm just gonna roll up into a little ball and roll through
And get through the crack.
small,
Yes.
a small
Feel bad for your
crack, yeah.
spine.
Yeah, very nice. Well, with that, we'll see you next time. Good night. Thank you for joining the Lost Signals Games and Gaming Culture. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows and more, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.